Welcome back, fellow jazz bums. We are super excited to have Jerome Sabbagh here. We connected with Jerome later last year about his new album Vintage, and he was nice enough to come and join us today. Before we get into it, remember to like and subscribe. We're going to link to our Jazz Bums Discord in the description below. And we also live stream every Friday, so come and hang out with us there. That said, I'm going to kick it over to Felipe to get us started.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much. Bienvenue, Jerome. Welcome back to the channel. So today we have one more interview. Today we're interviewing Jerome Sabbagh. Jerome, he was born in Paris, 1973. He studied saxophone with Philippe Chain and Ribaret, and got in contact with jazz, Kenny Barron, other stories that he's going to tell us later. Then he studied here in the U.S. At the Berklee School of Music. Since then, he's been, playing different bands, different formations, playing a great saxophone. He started Flipside with Greg Tuhoni. Then after touring, he also played the Laurent Koch, Brandon Owings, releasing records that different mutations, different aspects of music there. He's been recently playing a lot with, he's been playing with bassist Joe Martin recently, and his last record is called Vintage. He came out on Sunnyside Records, and he plays with and in sort of tributes to Kenny Barron, and we're going to explore this record in more detail and depth, as well as his career. Welcome, Jerome. Thank you so much for meeting with us.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, like I said, thanks for doing this. And first question we usually ask everyone is, like, as a child, what was your musical experience at home? And then, how did you get into jazz? And obviously, how did you get into playing saxophone?
So I actually was not exposed to jazz much at home. It was classical music only, but at least there was music. I started being exposed to jazz at school in Paris when I turned 13. There was a great music teacher there by the name of Annick Chartreux. And the first class, she played Mozart, Miles Davis, and Jimi Hendrix all in the same class, which really kind of blew my mind and opened things up, certainly to the jazz side of things, but also to other things. There was also an orchestra in that middle school, which is very common here in the US, but actually not common in France, where I'm from. So I saw somebody play saxophone in that orchestra, and basically my best friend and I right there decided that we wanted to try to play saxophone, and that's how I got my start. Like maybe the first record that I listened to was Kind of Blue. That led to Giant Steps because Coltrane was on Kind of Blue, and so I got Giant Steps, and then Coltrane led into Sonny, and Sonny led into Dexter, and it was kind of like a process of like discovery, little by little. Back then, it was LPs, and also I got my first CDs, which, Giant Steps was one of those. The Köln Concert was another one. Dexter Gordon, Our Man in Paris was one that I got really early. So basically, that's kind of how I got my start.
Real quick follow-up there. You said the musical teacher, introduced you to all this stuff. Is music education important in France? Because it seems like it's kind of just disappearing here. I mean, if you're like in band or you're in orchestra or whatever, you're exposed to it. But when we were kids here, we had music teachers, and I don't that everyone, participated in, and I think that's kind of disappearing. Is it?
Yeah, it's still mandatory in France. I was very lucky because I had a rather exceptional teacher, and a lot of the teachers who are in the school system in France teaching music are not necessarily that great. So I just was extremely lucky to have somebody who was also a great pianist, a composer, somebody who was like very knowledgeable about classical music, but also jazz and other things. So I think I'm the exception rather than the norm, but there is music education. I just don't know how good it really is across the board. And certainly the orchestral aspect of it. Having a band in a high school, that's not common. That's something
Okay.
that she just did because she wanted that. But that was also an exception and not the norm.
So, so what do you think it was about the saxophone that kind of grabbed your attention?
I think it was the sound, and probably that's still what I care about the most in terms of playing. I think like saxophone is close to the human voice in a way. Like I also love the fact that everybody can play. I mean, it's true on any instrument, but particularly on saxophone, I think the spread of sound that you can get from, let's say, Dexter Gordon to Stan Getz to Michael Brecker to Coleman Hawkins. Like we're talking about like 4 people who play the same instrument, and I could have named another 40, and it's a radically different sound conception. So I think that aspect of it really appeals to me, and always has. And developing my own voice sonically has always been something that I was very interested in.
Yeah, definitely. Just thinking about like the signature of certain artists, like comparing like a Ben Webster in like Quebec to like a John Coltrane, it is like a completely different voice, right?
Yep. Yep. And yet it's the same instrument, and a lot of times it's similar gear. Not to get too geeky about it, but like, you know, a lot of times it's like the same or similar make saxophone. And back in the day, a lot of people were playing Auto-Lynx mouthpieces, whether metal or rubber, and using the same gear, people were still getting and are still getting radically different sounds.
Is that more specialized now than it was back then, you think?
Like the gears?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. I actually gravitate towards kind of old school gear that like people could have had in the 40s or 50s. And again, without getting too geeky, like I like gear that allows you to find your own voice. And I find that some of the modern gear, it skews it a little bit. It kind of makes you want to play a certain way. It makes it almost too easy to get a sound. So, you know, for example, like I like Auto-Lynx mouthpieces because that's what everybody played on, and they allow me to get the sound I want. But the next person playing them would get a different sound. I mean, if their sound conception is, you know, strong, I guess. So, yeah, it's like, it's a matter of finding your own voice and having gear that allows you to do that, basically.
And how was that process for you to find your own voice? How was that work? How did you come to the conclusion, this is how I want to sound, and I'm going to work towards that way? Was that ever a moment like that?
Yeah. Well, there was like, first, like there were influences. So I like the sound of this person or that person. I like very different sounds. So I love the sound of Stan Getz. I also love the sound of Dexter Gordon. They're very different, you know. So there was a time where I was really trying to hear, and I am still trying to hear the sound that I want in my head. And I think first, if you want to have a sound on an instrument, you have to hear it in your head, and you have to decide, kind of like have a clear mental picture of what you want to sound like. And then if you put in the work and you practice, then you are able to achieve that on your instrument. So there's exercises you can do, like there's exercises that you do for sound, but I think it comes first from having a certain amount of clarity, mental clarity about what you want to sound like. Same on any instrument.
Yeah, we've heard that from, like, we talked to Nick Phillips. He's a record producer, and he runs a school out on the West Coast, and his thing was, he's like, everybody sounds like someone else at first because you're just trying to get a sound that you're familiar with, and then it takes the time to actually develop your own sound. Have you arrived to that point, or is this a lifelong pursuit to, you know, improve or change or whatever?
It's definitely a lifelong pursuit to improve and to change and to evolve. In terms of sound, I feel I have arrived at like something that I like, that I think is fairly recognizable. I'm always trying to perfect it. I'm trying to expand my vocabulary. I'm trying to write some more music. I'm always working on my ear, my time, like, I'm always working on different things. But if we're strictly talking about sound, that's something that I feel I've, arrived at a certain thing that I'm comfortable with and that I like.
Awesome.
Yeah, that just reminds me, we were chatting about they're reissuing a Joe Henderson record, and so a lot of people have been going back and revisiting those records and his catalog in general. And I feel like he's an example where you can hear his earlier stuff, which is excellent, his like mid-career stuff, which is excellent, and then that later stuff is phenomenal. So
Yeah.
and they you could see the progression and changes, but it definitely is like a lifelong process. But I think in every iteration, it's it's excellence in its own way, and it is different. So I think I feel like it does sound like it's more of like an evolving thing, depending on who you're playing with, where you're at in your life, and what you've done in the past, and what you're interested in now versus what you were interested in before.
Absolutely. And Joe Henderson is a good example because he's very recognizable, but at the same time, he has really evolved. And like at the end, he doesn't sound quite the same as the beginning, but yet it's very recognizable. And also, I mean, I really love Joe Henderson, and like, to me, he's probably one of the most consistent players in terms of like recorded excellence. It's like, I can't think of a single Joe Henderson record or even a Joe Henderson album that he's a sideman on where he doesn't sound amazing. Like, he's got to be, the one of the most like consistently excellent, musician there is, and certainly I was lucky enough to hear him play live 2 or 3 times.
Oh yeah.
And those were seminal experiences for me. Like, I remember one time in Boston particularly where it was just like mind-blowingly good, and it was both like extremely inspiring in terms of like setting the bar extremely high for what that kind of artistry can be, and at the same time it was a little daunting, sort of like, whoa, like, is this even achievable? Like, like this is not humanly possible, just because it was so good, not just on a technical level, like on a mental level, on like a clarity of conception, like how developed his vocabulary was, the sound, the rhythm, the phrasing. So yeah, I can't say enough great things about Joe Henderson, for sure.
Sure. And still on that regard, Jerome, you mentioned, consistency, guys like Joe Henderson, but you played all over. You went to New Zealand, you played with us, Latin American, South American, Brazilian. So how this whole thing packs into your background, and I know you have a special appreciation for Brazilian music as well, and is reflected in Vintage.
Yeah, I mean, I listen to a lot of different stuff. Brazil, I love Brazilian music. I think you're alluding to the song that's called Elson's Energy on Vintage, which does have like a, Brazilian feel to it. I wrote it for a childhood friend from Brazil, who I grew up with in Paris, and who I recently had reconnected with. I think you kind of synthesize your influences, and they come out of your sound, particularly writing, because when you're writing music, you're slowing things down. So it's like you can take the time to write something and figure out what you want to do with it. And I certainly come out of like the tradition of jazz, but I also listen to a lot of different things. And particularly when I write music, I think those influences come out.
Going to Vintage, John just mentioned it. Vintage is a record sort of focused or thought about your Kenny Barron experience, right? How did the whole thing started? Because I thought I think you met him early in your life, right? And then you kind of had a chance to work with him much later.
Yeah.
How was that journey?
Well, interesting because I briefly, fleetingly, met Kenny Barron when he was playing with Stan Getz in Paris. That was another seminal concert for me. I saw Stan Getz twice, and the second time was with Kenny Barron. The quartet that he had was Rufus Reid on bass and Victor Lewis on drums. And so I waited for them backstage, outside the theater in Paris. And I got them to sign my ticket, and I talked to them a little bit. And, I was 15 years old, and I was like, had just started playing, and I was a fan. And Kenny Barron to me sounded particularly exceptional in that concert. So years later, Stan Getz is no longer with us, but the three other guys very much are. And I got to play with Victor Lewis, and now I got to play with Kenny Barron. And the way that came about was I reached out, and we ended up playing a duet at his house. And I really enjoyed it. And that kind of sparked the idea of like maybe trying to do a record with him. Took a few years to actually get done. The pandemic hit. It wasn't easy to get it all together, but eventually we did. So yeah, it's this is like 35 years later, and there's something satisfying to the idea that like I'm able to connect and make music with like people who were and still are my heroes, but like were my heroes when I started playing music at age 15, and Kenny Barron is certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Can you talk about just the concept of the album? I mean, obviously it's named Vintage and has a certain sound to it.
Yeah, so this is like a record that I really kind of conceived of to play with Kenny Barron. It's a mix of standards and original music. It's original music that I thought he would like and connect to. So it doesn't necessarily represent the spread of what I can write or do musically, but it was like those were tunes that I thought he would sound good on and he would connect to. And that was important to me because I don't want to bring stuff that he might not, really be into or something. I wanted to try to figure out songs from the repertoire and also write music that he could grasp quickly and we could sound good on and have fun playing. So nothing too complicated. Something that would be basically standard bass, or like if there were originals of mine, they would still have like this standardy kind of feel to it. I knew that like we weren't going to be able to rehearse much. So it had to be stuff that we could like get to right away and have fun on. So yeah, we did one rehearsal and then we did the session. Vintage was a tune of mine that I wrote, and I ended up giving the record that name, but it wasn't meant so much as a statement. It was more like a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. But it also does fit what I think is a pretty straight-ahead jazz record. And it also fits the way we recorded it, where we're all in the same room, and we panned it like an old school jazz record, which is what I like to do anyway, regardless of, even when I play kind of more quote modern stuff, that's how I like to present recorded music anyway. But yeah, I think it fit. I think it fit like both the music and the way that we approached it. But really, it's kind of like it's something I did to connect with Kenny Barron and try to document that, and also have the record as duets. There's 7 tracks on it, and there's 3 duet tracks, and I have to credit Jonathan Blake, the drummer on the record, for that, because even though my first musical experience with Kenny was playing duet at his house, I hadn't necessarily planned on recording any duets. And Jonathan at the session actually suggested it at a break, and he's like, "Hey man, you should really take advantage of the fact that Kenny is here and like maybe play some duets. And I was like, oh, that's an excellent idea. And so I asked him, and he was down, and that's how we ended up doing those tracks. And there's some of my favorite, I think maybe Ask Me Now is my favorite track on the record. And it really did feel special to be able to document playing duet with him in particular.
So no, it definitely came across. I mean, there's something special about a duet when it just, I don't know, man. It's just the soul of the two when it comes across well, right? And these definitely did, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's just like the soul of the two players, and it's stripped down, and it's just something special about that.
That's great. And Jerome, so did you, after you decided you were going to do a duet, were the tracks already chosen, or you chose those Monk tunes after you decided to do a duet?
No, chose at the moment we played. Like we went back and we went into the studio, and I was like, how about we do this and how about we do that, and we just did them. But Monk was a logical choice because Kenny Barron knows all Monk's music. He had a band called Sphere, which was dedicated to Monk's music. So I know that he knows all those tunes and loves all those tunes. And I know a lot of those tunes. And I also love those tunes. And I'm a big Thelonious Monk fan in general. So it felt natural to play these two. And then the third one we play is not Monk, it's Strayhorn. It's Flowers of Love Something. And I had heard Kenny Barron do that at the Vanguard. And I thought it was stunning. And so I asked him to do it because I knew he played it, and I loved the way that he played that tune. He has a little harmonic thing that he does on the A section. And so I just asked him if he would play it, and he agreed.
One of the things that you mentioned is the recording style, and in kind of going back and learning about your background and listening to interviews, one thing that absolutely stands out is the interest that you have in the sound reproduction piece of it, and then the production piece of it. So it sounds like you're very hands-on with the whole process, and you're the decision maker, or at least part of the decision-making process. This vintage piece, I think, has it is a throwback to that older, maybe like late 50s style, and I think that it achieves that. But I also think there's like kind of a special tonality or style to it that I think does make it stand out as well. I think it's unique in its own way as well. So, but I think the greater question that I want to ask is the production piece, the decision of how you wanted to record it. How did that develop, I guess, overall in your career? And then when you're with the musicians in the room, is that something that you're discussing with them, or is that more of the engineer conversation? If you can speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So yes, I'm very hands-on with all that kind of stuff. I'm basically the decision maker as far as like how we decide to record. And that developed fairly early on. And I think it connects to our earlier conversation about saxophone sound, because I spent so much time working on my sound and being aware of sound and trying to get the best sound I can and trying to get the clarity that I want and the shades that I want, that when I started recording, I wanted that to translate. So it was a matter of like, okay, I work on sound, like I think I kind of have a sound that I like now. How do I get that recorded and reproduced? And that's how I got into it, because when I made my first record as a leader fairly late, I mean, there was a record that we did in '97 called Flipside, and that was a collective, but that I wasn't so much involved in the production side of things yet. But when I made my first record, North, in 2004, I was already 30 years old. And so, I had some experience doing records with other people. And it was a matter of like really trying to learn about microphones and studios and engineers. And basically what I did was I listened to a bunch of modern records And I figured out pretty quickly that most of the ones I liked were recorded by James Farber. So I called up James Farber and I was like, hey, I would really love to work with you. And can we, would you record my album? And he said yes. And I learned a lot from him over the years. We've done maybe 5 or 6 records together at this point. And he actually was not involved in Vintage. He was supposed to be, but that didn't work out. So I ended up, doing a different thing. But most of what I learned over the years, I learned working with him because, it was like a choice of studios. And then the fact, most of my records, again, not vintage, but most of my records are recorded live to 2-track by James Farber. And so that means the mix is done directly live, like would have been done in the days of like Rudy Van Gelder and Roy Denan and people like that. So that process is very similar to a 50s, 60s record. The use of tape also, like I think tape sounds better. And that's also a thing that James was into. So my very first record, he was like, well, why don't we do it live to 2-track and why don't you record it to tape? So those records were all recorded to tape even 20 years ago. They never came out on vinyl and they're only CDs, but they were initially recorded to tape. So, over the years, I learned about what microphones I like, what rooms I like to play in, what consoles I like to record with, what reverbs I like. I'm someone who likes to record everybody in the room. I don't like to use headphones. So we set up in a way that we can all hear ourselves. And that, again, is also a throwback to the 50s and 60s. And it's not something that a lot of people do now, because most people now record in booths and you got headphones and you see everyone through partitions. And that right there is a huge divide, because you don't hear each other naturally. So the band doesn't really get a chance to balance each other out and to play as a unit, because everybody's separated. And also, one thing that people don't necessarily know about is like when you're recording in a good studio, if you're in a booth, you'll have a little mixing board, a mini mixing board next to you, and you'll be able to turn up the bass or turn up the drums or whatever. And so you're creating your own mix so you can hear what's going on, but everybody's doing that in their corner. So there's no real band dynamic like there is when you play a live gig. So that's also why, to me, it's really important that we don't do that and that we play everybody in the room, because then we get a chance to sound like we do live and have dynamics, hear each other in the same way. And I think that translates into better music. And I also happen to think that that translates into better recording quality, because you're getting bleed and you're getting everybody playing in the same room, and it sounds more natural and it sounds more convincing. So all my records were done this way, basically, everybody in the room. I don't have a single record as a leader that wasn't done everybody in the room. Yet pretty much all the records I am on as a sideman were done the other way. So I have the other experiences, like, so anything I'm on that I'm not a leader on was done in a booth pretty much, or with somebody at least in a booth, and everything I'm on as a band leader was done in the room. And I definitely don't want to record any other way, because I think for this kind of music, you want the interaction, you want the almost physical feel of hearing people in the same room. And I also think it sounds better.
No, just asking, for vintage, you went multi-track, right?
Yeah, vintage was multi-track, but the reason for that was actually that James wasn't available to do it. I would have done it live to 2 with James, but James is also at this point the only person that I really trust to do a live to 2, because it's really hard to pull off. So when he decided he didn't want to do it, and that was because, it was during COVID and he didn't really want to work during COVID. So I didn't want to wait until COVID was over, because we didn't know if and when it was going to be over. And so I decided to go multi-track, which is something I had done before, but not with multi-track tape. So, and this, I definitely wanted this album to be done to tape because, my last couple of albums have been done to tape, but also pressed onto vinyl, all analog. And I wanted to keep that going because that's how I'm able to produce these records, is like by having them be all analog. I have developed like a little bit of a following in that, and audiophile slash vinyl lover community, and that's how I'm able to produce these records. So I knew I wanted to do multi-track, but then that got me into doing multi-track tape, and that's the only time that I've done that. And I may or may not do it again because that was pretty technically challenging. It was very expensive. Tape is very expensive. Multi-track tape is insanely expensive, and then you got to mix it. So it would have been easier to do it live to 2-track, but that's not how it turned out. And in a way, it was great because it allowed us to really spend some time mixing it. And the person who mixed it is Pete Rendy, who's a fantastic pianist and engineer. And Pete and I are actually creating a label next year that's going to be an all analog jazz record label, and it's going to be called Analog Tone Factory. And my next record is
That's awesome.
So you guys are the first to I haven't really been talking about that too much, but we're starting this, and my next record, which is a trio project with Joe Martin and Al Foster on drums, is going to be the first record on the label.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's cool. I was just going to go back to like the recording techniques and stuff you were talking about. We met with Anthony Wilson recently, and he just got done recording a record with Kevin Gray, and Kevin's got the new studio where he's doing the same kind of thing, which is really interesting. The point was, Anthony said that at times he would have problems finding musicians who wanted to record like that. That a lot of people felt much more comfortable in the booth with their own mix and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That never really came up with like the people I play with, because basically I if I'm gonna record, like that's the way we do it. Like I'm up front with everybody and I'm like, look, this is what we're gonna do. But it is a conversation you want to have because most people are not used to doing that anymore. And it's a different way of thinking. If you're in a booth, you can fix anything. So that's the big advantage of doing that. I guess I didn't mention that, but like if you're in a booth and like you play a wrong note, you can erase it, especially if it's like Pro Tools. If it's all digital, between the booth and the digital, you can really do anything you want. So you can fabricate a solo from 7 different takes. You can cut and paste things. You can do all that. Now, I don't like to do any of that. And I don't like to cut and paste solos. I don't like to make something that's not in the moment. Like I want to capture a moment, and if the moment isn't great, then I pick another take, But yeah, it is very much a conversation you want to have. I've never had an issue with anybody not wanting to do it. But for example, Kenny Barron, I'm sure he's done a ton of records like this because he started his career in the 60s. But I don't think he had recently. So when I told him we were doing this all in a room and we were not going to be punching in stuff and all that, he was totally cool with it. But, there was a funny moment at the end of one of the songs where we played an ending that wasn't super clean. And then he was like, oh, is that okay? And I was like, yeah, I think it's okay. And we ended up not using that track, but for other reasons. And you can hear him on the tape saying, oh, back in the days, we'd have punched that in, which was kind of funny because back in the days recently, yes, would have punched that in. Back in the days, did have done the same thing we were doing.
Exactly.
So yeah, that was kind of funny. But yeah, it's I also think it puts everybody in a different mindset when you're all in a room. You're not gonna be punching things in. You gotta kind of play for real. Like, you know, I think it's better for the music too. That's also a reason that I do it, is like it puts everybody in the mindset of like, okay, we're not going to redo stuff. Let's try to, it forces everybody to kind of be in the moment to give the best they have. And I think, and then it works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then maybe you don't put that track on the record, or you do it again, or you move on. And so for Vintage, I recorded a lot of things. You know, the record has 7 tracks. I recorded 14, I think. So I had twice more material than I needed. And then I just picked the stuff that I thought was best, and I made the record that way. But
well, that way you can, in 20 years, you can reissue the 2 LP version, man, with all the you know, all
outtakes and all that. Yeah. But it's interesting what Anthony said. Like, yeah, I do think probably a lot of musicians are not comfortable doing that these days. But the people that I work with, everybody was game to do it, and has been game to do it over the years. So I haven't had that issue. But yeah, I mean, most people choose to do the opposite thing, you know, where everybody's in a booth and you get all that control, and you know, I can see the advantages of that for sure, but that's just not what I prefer.
I think
I feel like it takes some of the humanity. I mean, some of the humanity out of the music too. Like if everything's just perfect, right? Like
I think so. I think so. It's like you can hear that on records too. It's like it's perfect, it's clean, but it's a little soulless, and it's a little disconnected. There's a weird kind of level of disconnect that if you play all in a room, usually that's better. You know, you'll get at least something going that'll be a little more real, a little more authentic. I find it really difficult to play in a booth and get that level of rapport. And also, what I'm interested the most, I think, in this music is connection, is having a conversation, reacting to what drummer plays, and playing music together. And that's definitely much easier, everybody in a room. And then it also goes with, you know, recording to tape. Same thing. It's like if you're going to edit anything on tape, it's much harder. So you got to have a really good reason to do it. And in a way, all those limitations work in your favor, because they force you to make good decisions, or the best decisions you can to start with. And in digital, it's so easy to edit stuff that it's very tempting to edit stuff all the time, whether you're in a booth or not. Like, you could also splice 2 takes together and whatever. Now, you can do that in analog too, but it's much harder. Something that takes 2 minutes in Pro Tools takes like an hour with a razor blade with tape. So you got to have a very good reason to do it, because otherwise you're wasting time. Studio time is expensive. Tape is expensive. If you mess up the tape, well, there's your take, you know. So it's like the stakes are higher. So I think those limitations are actually a good thing. I mean, now if you play music that's so complicated that like you really need the flexibility of editing, and you really, to get a better representation of the music, you really need to be able to cut and paste it, and maybe it's so hard to play that like you got to do it like that, more or less. But the stuff that I gravitate towards, it really kind of isn't like that. It's more like in the tradition of, even when it's original music, it's in the tradition of jazz, and it's not overly complicated, or at least I don't think it is. And so we can play it, you know, we play it live, and can get in the studio and do the same thing. And that's what I like.
One of the things, all of this resulting in, you know, in these products that have been reviewed, and you mentioned that the kind of the audiophile side of things and record collectors, they've found your material, and they've really kind of gravitated towards it. I know that there's been really excellent reviews of Sonics and music for Vintage. And I think I think that, I mean, I just think it's interesting, because it seems like this record has a broader audience than just the jazz listener, because of that. It's, you know, it's people who are into music reproduction, and finding a home there. I think it speaks to the quality, number one. And I feel like it probably is like validating as well, that people pay attention to this stuff, care about this stuff, and recognize it. So I guess, how have you how have you kind of found a home there? I mean, was it just a natural thing because you were interested in hi-fi yourself? You're interested in the production piece of it, and then that just kind of naturally came, and people found you rather. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. Yeah, I'm more or less an audiophile at this point. Like, and I became one kind of through necessity because I needed something that was good enough at home to assess my recording. So at the same time that I started recording as a leader, I got a decent pair of speakers and I started getting into it because I was like, okay, I need something that I can make decisions on. And it's got to sound more or less like it sounded in the studio. So I'm not making bad decisions because what I have at home is just not on a certain level. So I think all this coalesced into reaching people who are into that kind of thing. But really what happened is 10 years ago, I made a record called The Turn. And that was recorded to tape, like most of my records. But at the time, I didn't have enough money to run tape for the whole record. So what we would do for all these records is we would record them to tape, but we would use two reels and reuse the tape by going over it. So basically you can do this live where because a tape recorder has a record head and a play head. So you can record and at the same time you can bounce it to digital from the playhead. And so you get the sound of the tape, but you can reuse the tape. And I've made a lot of records that way because I didn't have enough money to buy enough reels of tape to make it work.
Okay.
So The Turn was done that way. A lot of other records, I mean, a fair amount of my Live to 2 records, they were done that way up to The Turn. So when I made that record, I sought out a very famous mastering engineer who you guys probably know, Doug Sachs. And I loved his work, like certain records. I love the remaster he did of Way Out West. I love the Ray Charles, Betty Carter record that's in digital that he remastered. So I sought him out and I asked him if he would master the record. And given that he was in LA, actually, I even asked him very respectfully to do a test track for me because I was going to send the material to him and I wasn't going to fly to LA because, again, I couldn't afford it. So I sent him a track and I was like, would you be willing to do a test and I'll pay you whatever you want? And he didn't charge me. He did the test. I got it 2 days later and it was fantastic. So I was like, okay, obviously I want you to do the record. And, I also went out of my way because, it was a little bit of a gutsy move on my part to like seek out somebody who was a legend and ask him to do a test track for me. But I was like, look, I love your work. I know this record, that record, that record. I really want to work with you. But at the same time, I'm not going to be able to fly to LA and do it with you. So I just want to kind of see if this is going to be a good fit. And would you agree to do a track? And he was game. He did it. And then he did an amazing job on the record. And he is actually responsible for starting this whole thing because he suggested that I do it on vinyl. He was like, look, even though at this point it's kind of a hybrid because it went through the tape, but it's high-res digital, he was like, this record sounds really good. I could cut it from the analog signal, because once it goes, he was using analog EQs and all that. So it got converted twice, basically. And at the end, he was in the analog domain, and then he had to get back up to digital to do the CD and all that. But he was like, I could cut an LP this way, and it would sound great. And that got me thinking. I was like, well, I've got like one of the greatest mastering engineers of all time who's suggesting that I do this. Maybe I should take him up on it. And so what I did is I did a fundraising campaign on Kickstarter, and I was like, hey, the record already exists. Here's the digital. I've got Doug Sachs ready to cut it for vinyl. I need this much money. Is there enough interest to make this work? And then the Kickstarter was successful, and then Doug Sachs did cut the LP, and it attracted I had a little bit of a following because of the Kickstarter, and then it got reviewed in Stereophile, and Michael Schremer reviewed it at the time for Analog Planet, and he raved about it, and I had pressed 500 copies, and thanks to those 2 reviews, particularly I think Michael's one, but Stereophile 2, we sold out, and I repressed 500, and then I sold out of that, and that gave me the idea to, for the next ones, keep it all analog, and try to develop this thing. Now that I had a little bit of an audience, try to see if I could produce the next record and afford the tape. And that's what I did. I did another Kickstarter that has been kind of like a business model where I fundraise. And the next one that I did was called No Filter, and that was a live 2-2 by James Farber. So was The Turn. And this is the first record that we did all analog, where we're like, okay, let's buy a bunch of tape and let's try to keep it all analog, because I would have done that for the other records too if I had been able to afford it. But I didn't think I could. Because of the success of The Turn, I thought that maybe I can do this, so I did it for No Filter, and now I'm doing it for Vintage, and I'm about to create a label where we're going to try to keep that business model going for my next record, but also hopefully produce other people. So yeah, it's been that's basically how the whole thing came about. So I have Doug Sachs to thank for it, because it was his idea. He was like, you should do this on vinyl, and I was like, I wasn't even thinking it was possible at the time. And then I got lucky because I was a reader of Analog Planet at the time, so I knew who Michael Schremer was. I just sent him the record, and he really liked it, and he was supportive of the Kickstarter too. Like, he thought it was a good idea, so that really kind of helped put me on the map with at least a certain type of audience. And I've been trying to cultivate and develop that audience since, because basically that's how I produce these records. If I kept those records in the digital domain, first, I don't think they'd sound as good, but also I couldn't sell them. I couldn't produce them because I'd be losing thousands of dollars, because nobody buys digital music, and you can't make any money with streaming, at least in a niche market such as jazz. So, this has been a way for me to finance music the way that I, want to record it, and work with people that I want to work with, and have a recorded output. It's been a way to produce records, So yeah, I'm very grateful for the kind of buzz I'm getting in the audiophile and vinyl lover community, because that's been hugely important. That's what allows those records to get made. And I find it really encouraging that, like, this blueprint has worked for me for 2 or 3 records, and that's why I'm hoping it can keep working, expand, and I'm hoping we can produce other people's music this way, and really trying to get something going.
Right. So, Jerome, yes. So from that, two questions came to my mind. First, that whole experience, like fundraising and producing, knowing the whole process, how it works, was that what gave you the confidence and the knowledge to start your own label now? And also, if you have been asked by other artists to produce their records?
Yes and yes. So first question, I mean, because this has been successful enough that I've been able to make my own records. Well, I've got one in the pipeline, and that has given me the idea to try to see if this is doable with other people, and we'll find out. I mean, the jury's still out, because it's still a lot of money. It's still hard to pull off. So I don't know if it's going to be successful. I hope it can be, because you know, it'd be great to be able to produce other people's music and to help put out music that I love into the world, also from a production side. So remains to be seen if we're going to be able to pull that off, but I'm hopeful because it's worked on Vintage and it's worked on No Filter, and you know, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from people about those records. So I'm hoping that it can work. As far as producing other people's record, I actually just did one where that's not going to come out on our label, but the drummer Matt Slocum asked me. I've been working on his records before a little bit because he's been pressing vinyl, and he asked me to at first to do quality control for him and help with the mastering, because I've been working with Bernie Grunman on the last records, and he was also working with Bernie, and so he asked me to help on the vinyl side of things. And for his new record, which we just went into the studio for about a month ago, he asked me to really be there in the studio and help him produce it. And that's another James Farber recording. That's a Live to 2. Hold on to tape. That's also going to be all analog. And so, yeah, that's somebody who asked me to do that. And I've done a little bit of production work for other people before. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll see where this all goes, but it's you know, it's encouraging. And you know, one of the things is like I buy a fair amount of vinyl, you know, so it's like I'm aware of like the reissues and I buy some of them, and like I listen to a lot of music. So I'm also on the forums, and it's like I see I read a lot of the same stuff, and I buy a lot of the same records that, you know, probably you guys are reviewing or checking out and stuff. And one of the, I don't want to say complaints, but one of the things I was reading, you know, a few years ago was like, how come there's not a lot of new music on vinyl recorded all analog? And that also was like, well, yeah, that also gave me the idea, like maybe this is doable, you know, and maybe there's like a certain almost like a yearn for it, you know, because it's so hard to do. It is really hard, you know. Everything with tape is hard. It's costly. The machines have to be perfect. It's really hard to pull off, and the pressing quality has to be good, and you know, so you go through test pressings. I mean, I'll spare you the details, but it is really it's a lot of effort to try to do it right. Yeah. But if you do, then I think people connect to it, and people realize that you're trying your best, and people want to support, or at least there's enough people who want to support that, like, maybe this is doable, you know. So at least that's what I'm gonna try to do.
With Vintage, I had a question about. So it was pressed at Runout Groove, right? Not Runout Groove. No, what's the pressing?
Got a Groove. Got a Groove. Yeah.
So are you involved in that part of the decision making too?
Yeah, that's all me. Like Vintage was done for, so the label that Vintage was done for is Sunnyside, but really my deal with Sunnyside, going back to the turn, is it's a licensing deal. So basically I license the digital to them, and I keep the rights to everything analog. Oh, cool. And that's also why I was already doing everything pretty much in terms of the quality control, the mastering, the pressing plant. Like those have been my choices all along. So the natural step after was like, well, why don't I also do the digital and create my own label? And that's what I'm going to do for the next one. But yeah, those choices are all mine. The turn was QRP, No Filter was QRP, Vintage is Got a Groove. The next one is going to be Got a Groove.
Well, they did a great job with it. I mean, it's an outstanding sounding record.
I think they did a great job. You know, it's like I'll probably work with QRP again. I actually, after Vintage came out, like Chad Kassem reached out to me, and you know, we've been in touch before, and he bought some copies for Acoustic Sounds.
Oh, cool.
And you know, we're talking, and like I have obviously like a you know, a lot of respect for everything he's done, both with Acoustic Sounds and Quality Records Pressing. So when Vintage was pressed, they didn't have the bandwidth to press it. So that's how I ended up at Got a Groove. But you know, Gotta Grooves, that they have been great. You know, I think they did a fantastic job, and I'm excited to keep working with them. And you know, if I can work with either Quality Records Pressing or Gotta Groove, I feel like I'm in good hands, because like,
Yeah.
you know, they're two very good pressing plants. And then the reality is it's very hard to press vinyl really well. So even in the best places, which I think those are, uh, you still got to do quality control, and you get test pressings, and you got to really listen to them and be careful. And like, if it's not right, you have to, you know, point it out. And I've certainly done that and been through that process. I've also done that for other people, you know, like I've been hired by other people to help with that step and do quality control and try to get it as right as possible. So yeah, I'm very involved with all of that, because you know, I'm like you guys. I buy records too, and like I don't want to get a shitty record
Right.
if I'm paying $40 for it, or whatever it is. You know, it's like it's got to be in a certain level, and it's hard to get it perfect, but it's got to be at least very good. It's got to be in the ballpark, and it's hard to be consistent. You know, it's so yeah, it's a difficult thing, and that's certainly part of the process. And I'm trying to be as careful as I can.
Well, I mean, it's risky business, because if you do put out a record and it gets a reputation for you know, being shitty or not being that great, that's devastating. It's, I mean, you know,
yeah. And I am well aware of that, and that's also why I'm going all out at every step of the process, whether it's recording, mixing, mastering, pressing plant, test pressings, all that. I'm really trying to do my best so that at least I'll have done everything I possibly can to get it right. And at the end of the day, what's nerve-wracking is that it's up to the plant in the end. So, you know, I had one experience where, wasn't one of my records, but like a record that I was working on, we got test pressings for, we approved the test pressings, and then the final run wasn't as good as the test pressings. And we contacted the plant and we asked them to redo it, and they did.
Oh, wow.
But obviously that's not what you want to happen, because you got a release date, and like and everything takes so much time. You know, but you know, what are you going to do? It's like, if the plant messes it up in the end, then you got to try to fix it. Thankfully, that did not happen on my records, and both plants that I've been working with really came through, and I'm pleased with what I got from both Quality Record Pressings and Got a Groove. But yeah, it's a big part of it, because you know, I send copies of vintage every day, and I get emails, and most of the feedback has been very positive. And once in a while, you know, I like, you get somebody who gets a less than perfect record, and so I have to deal with that too. And thankfully, the numbers the numbers of returns have been very, very low. So that's good, you know. But
you're always going to get some. I mean, it's an imperfect medium, right?
Yeah, you're always going to get some, but you want to keep it as low as possible, and you want to make sure people are happy with what they're getting, because if not, then it's a real problem, you know. And I get it, because I buy records too. Look, it's happened to me that to get a record that's like not great, and I send it back, and I try to get another copy and whatever. And you know, if you get your second copy and it's cool, then great. But like, you see people on the forums getting on their third or fourth copy of this or that record, and you're like, man, that's like, that's really tough, you know.
You mentioned that you're a record collector yourself, and I could see there's CDs behind you as well.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you could talk about your collection, the size of it, and then what's the makeup of it, and what are you going after? Anything?
And gear, of course.
And your gear.
Okay. Yeah, we're in the wrong room for records. This is like the CDs here. I have like a listening room where I have all my records. We can take a peek if you want. I'd have to kind of move the computer, but like I have a fair amount of records. I haven't counted, but I don't know if I have maybe. I'm gonna say maybe 800 records
Okay.
or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really kind of guesstimate.
Sure.
But a lot of jazz, fair amount of classical, some pop records. So I'd say it's probably 60% jazz, 25% classical, and the rest is other stuff. I have a lot of CDs too, and a fair amount of digital music. Like these days, if something comes out digital, I'll buy the high res file if I can find it. If something is on vinyl and I know it's good on vinyl, maybe I get the vinyl. If it's all analog, I definitely get the vinyl. And if it's a good reissue, all analog, whatever, I also get that. But most of the new music is digital anyway, so for that I may or may not get the vinyl depending on what I hear and stuff. But I do buy it, so I don't stream. It's kind of a principle thing. I'll buy a high res file because I want to support the artist.
Cool.
I don't have Spotify. I will not use Spotify. I don't want to, it's like my stuff is on it because I didn't really have a choice, like, and you want the music to be available digitally so people can listen to it. A lot of people listen to music that way, and I want it to be out, but like I don't want to like support that system. So it's like I'll buy the music from the artist, I'll buy the CD, I'll buy the file or whatever. As far as gear, I have is basically older gear. I have a Garrar 401 turntable. I have like a Fidelity Research tone arm. I have a Supex 900 cartridge, and I have Rogers JR 149 speakers that are basically LS3 5A type mini monitors. I have a Citation 2 tube amp that was redone, and I have a tube phono stage by Croft. So it's like, sensible hi-fi stuff, mostly vintage, but good sounding, I think. Certainly good enough that I feel I can make good decisions about mastering and mixing when I listen to stuff home, and I can certainly really enjoy listening to music. And the thing that's nice too is I have a room that's basically dedicated to music, and so I have my speakers in a place where they sound really good, and I put myself on the couch in the right place, and I can really listen to music where in the best kind of conditions possible, in the sense that like I've dedicated room and the speakers are where they are, and also I have stuff to treat the room on the walls. So it's a good listening environment, I think, without being very fancy necessarily, but like but it's nice.
I think just to wrap up on the record collector side or music appreciator, we are mostly in contact with American jazz, American musicians. Are you still connected with stuff from back home? And if so, some French artists that would recommend to us to listen to?
Sure. So I am still connected with people home. I go to Paris quite a bit. I play in Paris a fair amount. French jazz artist that I really like. Well, he's actually from Belgium, but there's a keyboardist by the name of Joseph Dumoulin. We've done a record together called Plugged In. That's only CD and digital, but I love his music. It's more like avant-garde-ish, a little experimental. He plays a lot of keyboards. I think he's a fantastic musician. I also, well, I don't want to keep plugging my own stuff, but I played on a record with Ben Monder and Daniel Humer, who is a legendary French drummer. He's 85 years old. He's also, more avant-garde-ish these days. He's more like a free player. but he's played with everybody. The interesting thing about him is like he grew up in the 50s and 60s playing with all the Americans that were coming to Paris. So he played with like Dexter and Johnny Griffin and Roland Kirk and Jackie McLean and Joe Henderson. He was like one of the first call European drummers. And then in the 70s, 80s, he started like doing different things and really opening the music up and playing more like improvised music. So we did a record years ago called "I Will Follow You," and I just saw him in Paris. That's also why I'm thinking of him. He still plays, and he's also a really accomplished painter, modern painter, and he's great at both. Like he has a dual career of being both like a painter and jazz musician. But there's Laurent Cook is an excellent pianist. I've also worked with him. He has a bunch of records out. He's a great composer. Also, he writes great music. Yeah, there's a lot of great musicians there too. In fact, later today in New York, I'm playing with a young vibraphonist by the name of Alexis Vallet, and I'm playing in his band at the Winter Jazz Fest
cool.
at the Zing Bar. And he's putting out a record next month, I think. I forget what his record is called, and I'm not on the record, but it's with Aaron Parks, Dana Stevens, Joe Martin, and Kush Abadi. And it's a really good record. Like I learned the music because I'm subbing for Dana and his band for tonight and Monday at Smalls. But the record is very nice, and so you can look out for that. I forget what it's called, but his name is Alexis Vallet, Valet.
Explorers.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, Jerome, we just want to thank you for coming on our channel, chatting through your background and the project that you've been working on. This was really interesting. For everyone watching, remember to like and subscribe and leave some comments. Let us know what you think about this interview. If you have vintage, we'll drop a link to your social media and the album itself. And when you start up that label, let's reconnect and we can,
absolutely. I'll let you guys know. And yeah, if anybody's interested in vintage, it's on my website at www.jeromesabbagh.com.
Awesome, man.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And again, thank you so much, Jerome.
Thank you guys. This was great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.